Welcome, everyone. We have no announcements, no pre-announcements, so we can go directly to our talk, featuring a speaker who needs no introduction, our own Ron.
Thank you.
I take it back. The one thing that Ron said to me, he asked me, are you doing optimum population theory at the beginning of 175 again? And I said, yes. He said, that's great, I'm going to talk about that. So that's just some 175 students.
Okay, so this is a paper, well, it's in evolutionary biodemography, which is an area I've been working on for 15 years or something. It's a joint with Cyrus Chu, with whom I've done a long series of papers on optimal life history theory. This all slowed down when Cyrus became a minister in the government of Taiwan, but then he left that post, but then he became ambassador to the World Trade Organization for Taiwan, where I think he still is, so things have slowed down. Anyway, sociality, social behavior, social grouping, and so on, characterizes a small percentage of species, of animals in nature. It appears in insects, something like 2% of species are social, but social animals are extremely successful. And so the biomass of social insects, although only 2% of the species are social, the biomass is probably more than 50% of the biomass of insects. And of course, people are pretty successful and so on. Why be social? Well, we could go through a long list of costs and benefits, but I'm going to focus on just two. One is how it affects production, and the other is how it affects reproduction. Although there are many other things involved, I think they're interesting things to learn here. So the idea is there are increasing returns to the size of the group in terms of production that we'll look at in a moment. And what is new here, I think, is the idea that there are also increasing returns in reproduction. That is, declining average costs per birth if a reproductive female has more births. And it's the interplay of these economies of scale, you might say, loosely speaking, in production and reproduction that leads to many features of social animals in terms of the size of groups and the family structure and so on. Okay, so that's what we'll be talking about. And economies of scale in fertility then favor, in a group, concentrating fertility, perhaps in a small number of females, so not all females reproduce. Or alternatively, it may favor concentrating fertility in just a segment of the life cycle of a female, instead of having the female reproduce over her whole life cycle. And a sort of tiny glimpse of this, I remember my wife's aunt, who was a sociologist academic, had 4 sons. She had them in 3 years, one at a time, to economize on her time. That's trying to take advantage of economy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these things a little bit generally and schematically in the beginning. I'll talk a little bit about how it's possible in terms of natural selection and putting DNA into the next generation and so on. How could you evolve non-reproducing females? I'm going to focus on 4 species that I think span the possibilities. Chimps, humans, African wild dogs, and honeybees, and then mention some other species that look kind of similar. Well, I'm sure there's a much greater variety, and the fact is if you look only at ants, you see a much greater variety than I'm going to describe here. Okay, and then towards the end, I'm going to come to the formal model and analysis. Okay, so optimal life history theory. This approach, which we take here and we've taken elsewhere, sort of skips over all the story of evolution, all the history of a particular species and how it got to be where it is, how particular organs or a jaw or things like that changed over time gradually. It's ahistorical, and it says, okay, here is a problem, here are some constraints. Nature is going to somehow find a way to get us to such a configuration. Perhaps this sounds ridiculous, but I want to suggest it's not totally ridiculous, because there are, articles that find that the same outcome, the same traits, sometimes evolve in completely different settings and with different species. That is, you can start in very different places and come to a similar kind of evolutionary solution to a bunch of problems. So this is convergent evolution in the sense, think of an equilibrium or something like that, versus what's called contingent evolution, where things depend heavily on where you start, and that's more historical and more hands-on. Okay, so to get to those of you who have taken 175, I think everyone here who's taken it would have taken it from Josh. We can start looking at production. And here we have number of producers on this axis, and on this axis we have total output, and this blue line is the total output curve. So we see it starts out rising faster than in proportion to the number of producers. That's increasing returns, but then as the population or number of producers gets bigger, then diminishing returns set in. So for a simple example would be if you think of a population that has more than proportional increases in output by some sort of cooperation in hunting or something like that, sharing information. But eventually, if this population has a base range, and if, like humans, you're bringing things back to a central place, your travel time is going to go up and up and up, and it's going to become more and more difficult to defend territory and so on. So, total output, and then down here we have corresponding the marginal output per additional worker. This would be how much it's a derivative of this curve at each point, how much output goes up if you add one worker. Here's the 0 point. So initially you see the increasing returns and then the decreasing returns. And then this is, the green line is average output per worker. And where the marginal output equals the average output, then you have the maximum average output per worker. And I'm going to suggest that populations tend to evolve towards that size. And of course, producers and everyone in the population have some basic food needs, which I will label S, and they're just proportional to the size of the population. So we have a straight line there starting at 0. That's the basic food needs. And then the difference between total output and these food needs is the surplus that is available for other purposes, but in particular, in this story, it's available for reproduction. And so this is going to be used for reproduction, and then the question is, well, how can it be used most efficiently? Or on a per capita basis, let's see, here is surplus need, which is independent of number, that is on a per capita basis. And so this is the per capita surplus, and here where we have the vertical, where the lines cross, that's going to be the maximum surplus available for individual. So if every female is producing as well as reproducing, for example, then she would eat that for herself, and then she would use this as additional energy needed for pregnancy and lactation or whatever. Okay.
And that's not influenced by discrete versus continuous reproduction?
Well, here everything is nicely continuous, and of course if we have social insects with millions of members, then we don't have to worry too much about that, but in some cases we should, but we're not going to. Okay, now there'll be some number of births and some number of deaths, and the births will depend on reproductive strategy. And if the group is growing and other similar groups are growing, then the density is becoming greater in this general environment that will have other groups as well. And then these curves are going to begin to shift down because of increased competition and smaller ranges. And the argument is that those that have the highest average output per person are the most efficient, and those are the ones that are going to survive as density increases and so on. And that's why I'm suggesting that that will be the tendency for number of producers to evolve towards that point.
Those are the units or the groups, the social groups?
Yeah, there are two units. There are individuals and there are groups. This is the only time I'm going to talk about sort of what's happening to the reproduction of the group and so on. Okay, so that was the production side. Now for the reproduction side. Well, it seems obvious that there are startup costs for any female that's going to be reproductive. And I'm mostly going to ignore males throughout this story, but which I think makes sense for the most part. But so females have to invest in a reproductive system, like ovaries and other things perhaps, and then they have some other costs that are perhaps fixed costs, like mate selection, acquiring and defending a breeding site, and so on. These are things that are prior to actual reproduction. So, but these are costly. So if you have a small number of births, then these fixed costs play a big role in what the average cost of a birth is. And perhaps by concentrating births in a small number of reproducers, you achieve a lower average cost per birth. One other thing is that in some species, for example in eusocial insects or naked mole rats, the reproductive females are physiologically specialized and different than the non-reproductive females. They're just sort of designed differently. They're genetically very similar, but they're fed differently when they're young, and that leads them to develop in a different way. So, these are just, schematic sort of calculations, not based on any data, but here we have number of births. This is for a single female. Number of births. Here we have fixed cost. That is what the first birth plus fixed costs here, I guess. This is the total cost, and it's assumed that that the incremental cost of a birth rises as the number goes up, but you have the fixed costs and their share go down, and so for the average costs per birth, you get something like this, which has a minimum here at 14 births, and then it very slowly rises. So, and then with physiological specialization, like the queen, you might have higher fixed costs, but lower marginal costs, and in fact, those queens may be producing 100,000 offspring a year or something like that in some cases. Okay, and here's the average cost curve in that case, which ends up being about half as high. These are just numerical wiggles showing if you were trying to produce 40 births, well, you could do it much more cheaply with the physiologically specialized female. And at some point, there's a limit to how far you get by concentrating births in an unspecialized, physiologically specialized female. So now I want to walk us through some illustrative cases, starting, well, there they are. Okay, starting with chimps. So chimps are sort of the control group here. No specialization, that is, every female is reproducing for her whole life. There's no menopause. Maybe in captivity, occasionally a female becomes non-reproductive, but basically they're reproducing from start to finish without specialization. They raise one baby, assuming it survives, until it reaches age of 5 or 6. That's the mean length of a birth interval for chimps in the wild. And then they bear another one, and the first one more or less fends for itself, at least nutritionally. Now, it's also important to note that the young females in chimp society disperse. So when they reach sexual maturity, they go off. They're going to go off. They don't have sisters, so they're going to disperse by themselves and try to find another group to live in. And the thing is, when they move into that group, every female in that group has come from somewhere else. They have no genetic or social allies. And there is, perhaps consequently, no cooperation in fertility and childbearing. And in fact, females occasionally kill and eat the babies of other females. Now, during this 5 or 6 years, well, I don't know how long they go on clinging, but the offspring clings to the mother's fur while she forages, so she's carrying that additional weight. It reduces her foraging efficiency, it raises her morbidity and mortality, it reduces her body weight. So this is inefficient. And I think this is probably, aside from the fact that chimps are plenty social, I think it's for other reasons, perhaps for sharing information, certainly I think for defending territory and that kind of thing. But I think this general kind of story is also true for most non-social solitary organisms as they go through life. Now humans, and here I'm talking about hunter-gatherers, mostly prior to contact or at least early after contact. As we know, young females specialize in fertility. Then eventually they reach menopause. That's the end. And then older women are non-reproductive, and they provide food, as do men, and some care time for the reproductive females. So this is an example, perhaps, this would be one interpretation of menopause, that it's a way of concentrating fertility among a fraction of the women who are alive at any time to realize economies of scale in reproduction. So that would certainly be a controversial interpretation of menopause, but that's what we're suggesting here. The human brain, growing the human brain, costs 43% on average of the calories a child takes in during its childhood. Yet that heavy nutritional load for brain development impedes physical development. So for example, during the child's growth spurts, the brain pretty much stops developing, and then between growth spurts, the brain develops more rapidly, and so on. So this entails long child dependency, and in fact, in hunter-gatherer groups, kids aren't nutritionally independent until they're 18 or 20. Not so different than today, you might say. So trying for a human female to try to raise offspring the way a chimpanzee does, sort of one at a time, wait till one's done and then go on to the next, would be totally impossible. So instead, the human females, the births are concentrated with short birth intervals, so something like 3 years perhaps. That was the case for the Anche. Whereas for chimps, it's 5 or 6 years for closed birth intervals in the wild. For orangutans, it's as long as 7 to 9 years in the wild. So there can be a big efficiency gain by concentrating fertility in the younger women. The mother can care for many dependent children at the same time, as my wife's aunt did, and it reduces the need for her to forage while she's lactating or pregnant, which is quite inefficient. I'll come back to that later. The grandmother, the grandfather, the male mate, perhaps aunts and uncles, other relatives, and perhaps just other unrelated households in the sharing groups in which humans live during the lean season of the year. 8 to 25 people, 3 to 4 households, considerable pooling of the food that comes in, then helps the mother feed her children. And then older men and women remain net producers, producing a surplus above that S and redistributing it to their children and grandchildren until after age 70 in the populations that I've seen studied, which are 4 of them or more now. So this fits with the grandmother hypothesis and with other stories. The modal age at death for hunter-gatherers appears to have been 70. This is based on the review by Urban and Kaplan. And for those who survived to 45, which was about the time of mean age of last birth, they'd have a remaining life expectancy of about 20 years. That's in a number of, found in a number of different hunter-gatherer groups. So that's the story for humans, and a similar story would hold for now 4 species of toothed whales have been identified as experiencing menopause, and then the postmenopausal females continue to contribute sort of babysitting and food sharing and so on. But so far as I know, those humans and these 4 species of toothed whales are the only documented cases of menopause and extensive post-reproductive survival in this sort of model. Okay, the second, I guess we're now on the third case, African wild dogs. There's a single reproductive female, the alpha female, and she is fed by the males and by the other females in the group. Pack size varies from 3 to 30. They are so-called obligate cooperative breeders. That is, a single pair, male and female, have never been observed to successfully raise pups. So they have to be doing this in a group. Now there's some nice data in this book by Creel and Creel. This is something like, well, here we have it. This is kilograms of meat per dog per kilometer of fast chase. That's the unit. So, which they favor is the so the dogs, they spend most of the day lying around, and then they're looking for prey and just standing there, and then they decide to go for it, and then they take off very fast. It's very energy consuming, and actually they have a higher success rate than any other predator in sub-Saharan Africa. So, but the point is, you have increasing returns and then decreasing returns with a peak at about 12 adult dogs. Let's see. Reproduction, well, as I said, there's a single alpha female. She has 1 litter per year. Litter size can be up to 21 pups, but mostly it's much smaller. After that litter, raising that litter, it takes about half a year, and then she becomes a producer after that. Packs with 10 or more adults had 3 times as many surviving pups, so here we're combining fertility and mortality, as smaller packs. And the alpha female hormonally suppresses ovulation in the other females. So, yeah. Now, how can this work? Well, I'll come to this later, but every female has a reasonable chance of becoming alpha female. It's not a lifetime role. Okay, so we also have some data here. These are observations of different packs of different size, and you see this. This is the litter size, and you see it going from whatever in this study from 3 to whatever, but as I said, they observed up to 21. And this is a quadratic that was fit by the authors. Now, a quadratic isn't going to be able to show increasing returns. I'd like to see cubics fit. But this also isn't the right association. We want to look at fertility by energy intake, like in that schematic I showed earlier. This is fertility by pack size. And we know from what we saw just a moment ago that output, surplus food isn't proportional to pack size. It's rising more rapidly. So it would be complicated to try to work this out, what I'd love to see. Creel and Creel, they give the coefficients of a quadratic they fit, and I just plotted it, and you see a similar sort of story. The point, and here you see, gee, with a pack size of, say, 17, you're getting maybe 5 or 10 times as many surviving pups as with a very small pack size. So, the point there is that the female reproduction is very responsive to how much food intake there is. It's not just, for humans, we don't think of that as a sort of close relationship, but in many species there will be.
If we think of this as like an NRR, what's the yearlings raised may be the numerator, what's the denominator? Is it 1, or is it all the females, or what is it? Yearlings
raised, this is a single reproductive female producing these yearlings, so I'm not sure that the denominator is 1 adult female reproductive. It's the number in the pack, but there's only 1 reproducer in the pack.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is do we want to divide by pack size in order to get kind of the NRR or something like that, or not, or because there's only 1 reproductive female?
Well, if you wanted to say, is this pack replacing itself? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? That would require a different kind of analysis. I have nothing on mortality in here really, except this little bit of from birth to being 1 year old. So I'm just addressing that in that sort of hand-wavy way I did earlier on. If births succeed deaths, the population is going to grow, then the curve is going to have to shift down if we assume that that's happening elsewhere. Density will increase, and that's sort of the dynamics, which wouldn't be hard to add, but it would be a more complicated story. So bees, okay, are an example of a eusocial insect. Honeybees I know a little bit more about, but the eusocial insects are bees, wasps, ants, and termites, which is, as I said before, not all of them, some species are. In the honeybee, there's one reproductive queen. Queens are chosen by the worker bees before they even emerge from the larval stage. They're just fed differently. And they're fed royal jelly, and that leads them to develop in a different physiological way. And the workers, when they want to produce a new queen, they will feed maybe a half dozen of the eggs in this way. And the first one of them that emerges kills the other potential rivals, so she's the only young queen. And she emerges with wings, and she has a special reservoir for storing sperm. She goes out on a maiden voyage for a day or two and encounters males from other hives, drones, that inseminate her. She might be inseminated by a half dozen different males, and their sperm is mixed in her reservoir, and then she draws on that for the rest of her life. She goes back, or she goes in a swarm, and when she is done with this flight, she sheds her wings, she digests some of the physiological equipment that allows her to fly, because she never flies again, and life goes on. So she can lay something like 2,000 eggs per day for a colony averaging something like 60,000 workers. The bees don't live terribly long, maybe a couple of months, although in winter they can overwinter for longer. Wilson says some of the eusocial insects have population sizes up to 20 million. Okay, now naked mole rats are, I think there are only two eusocial mammals, and I'm not sure what the other is, possibly another species of mole rat. They have a single reproductive alpha female, reproducing and lactating for an average colony size of 70, but can be up to 300. And these animals live entirely underground, and they eat the roots of plants and things like that, so they're very protected from predation, and they have incredibly long lifetimes. They're the size of mice or smaller, and many of them appear to live up to 30 or more years, not just the reproductive queen. Litters average 12, but they can be up to 30, and they can be up to 5 per year. So there's a great reproductive capacity. Where do these newborns go? How many of them survive? Are they going to setting out to go found new colonies or what? I don't know, because if they're living 10 to 30 years, they don't need anything like this number of births, but I haven't seen this discussed.
Now, why did you slip the naked mole rats in here?
Because they are eusocial in the sense that they have a single physiologically specialized reproductive queen who doesn't forage. So in that sense, they're like,
Okay,
yeah.
that's good.
Okay, so those are the 4 cases, and about to get to the model. But how could natural selection lead to outcomes with non-reproductive females? Well, one thing to take into account is that in some of these arrangements, the females are taking turns reproducing. So with humans and toothed whales, it's a life cycle stage. You reproduce when you're young, and then you have menopause, and so you're not giving up the chance to get your descendants into the next generation. There is the question, and there's a controversy over where people try to explain how this could have evolved, and is the trade-off worth it, and so on. And Cyrus and I had a paper in which we tried to work out when it would be possible for a cheating mutation to invade successfully, and what conditions such that it wouldn't, and so on. Now, in the case of wild dogs, a female that survives to age 5 has a 50-50 chance of being the alpha female at that point. If she survives to age 8, then she has a 100% chance that is among the group studied by Creel and Creel. So it isn't that the female is completely giving up her chance to get her own genes into the next generation. So that's the taking turns part. But the other part is kin selection and indirect promotion of own fitness. So if you are helping someone who's very closely related to you, who shares a lot of your genome, helping them to reproduce, then you are getting some of your DNA into the next generation indirectly through kin selection. The chimp females are not genetically related, and they don't help each other, so there's nothing to explain there. The menopausal humans and whales are assisting their own offspring and grand offspring to a considerable extent, and so that's not as difficult to explain, but it's still controversial. There's no, I don't think a widely, there's grandmother hypothesis and so on, but I don't think there's anything that's been completely nailed there. The wild dogs, as I said, the sisters disperse, or maybe I didn't, sisters disperse together from the natal group. Brothers disperse together from the natal group, and they go off in search of other groups they can join, or they found groups. And consequently, it's often the case that the females are related, that may be sisters, in a wild dog society.
Brothers and sisters are essentially littermates, so they're also the same age?
Yeah.
In this story?
Yeah. There's only one litter a year, and so, and they're going to be dispersing at sexual maturity, so.
So clearly they don't all, but some subgroups of, not the entire cohort goes, right?
Well, if the group, I don't know whether it's always all of it. Sometimes the groups are fed by new members coming in, yeah, that's sort of past the edge of my knowledge. Naked mole rats have the highest level of relatedness of any mammal group that has been observed at 0.81. There must be a great deal of inbreeding going on there underground. I don't know exactly what social story produces that. But that seems to be an important feature here. And then the eusocial insect workers, there's a lot of controversy. It used to be thought that this eusociality arose because of the haploid males with diploid females and all the sisters and so on. That's only true in some species, and Wilson, the great ant specialist, has recently been pushing the idea of group selection as opposed to individual selection as driving this, and kin selection. I don't know about all that, and I'm not going to try to discuss it further. But the point is, there's some help from the genetics here. 10 minutes, okay. So let's go to something formal. So here, big N co-residing females, forget the males. A proportion P are reproducers, that doesn't mean full-time. And a proportion 1 minus P are full-time foragers. Each individual has 1 unit of time to allocate. Becoming a reproducer has a fixed cost, which here we just expressed as fixed time. And so that T is somewhere between 0 and 1 fraction of the total time available. X is additional variable time that reproducers spend per birth, pregnant, lactating, and so on. So a reproductive female has 1 time unit. She uses T of it to build a reproductive system, and X of it, I'm not sure what I said above, but it's not per birth. X is her total input of time, but which can vary with the number of births she has. And then there's total foraging time. This is FTE producers, full-time equivalent producers, is little n. This is the number of full-time foragers. This is the bit of foraging time, anything that's left over by reproductive females, 1 minus T minus X. So for a human, for example, there'd be plenty of time left over after the time she devotes to reproduction. She would also be a forager. Total energy generated by the group. Well, this is that total output curve I showed you before. G is some function, and this is the number of producers. It's the same as that. S is the subsistence costs, or the food needs, basic food needs for any member of the group. M is the additional energy devoted to reproduction per reproductive female. And so we have a budget constraint. This is total output. This is the basic food consumption. This is the additional food consumption, the cost of reproduction for the reproductive females. And then we have another function that gives the number of surviving births per producer. B, it depends on the total energy for reproduction that she consumes, and it depends on the time she devotes to reproduction. We have total surviving births. And here we have proportion women reproductive, the total number in the population, and here is the fertility per reproducer. And then natural selection, we say, will favor the group with the highest average surviving births per female out of, so this would be number of births divided by capital N. Yeah.
So is this group selection then?
Haven't taken any position on that, but how could this be so? There's a whole, there's the idea that these are like organisms, superorganisms.
Yeah.
If you took that view, you might say, oh, what you want to do is maximize total births and not births per person in the population. The argument I was giving earlier is that if you tried to maximize total births, then you have to do it in an inefficient way by having a population that's bigger than the one that maximizes energy per person. And that as the population grows, because these smaller ones are going to be growing at that density, then those ones that are going for total are going to go extinct. And the ones that are left are going to be the ones with the highest per capita efficiency. So that's the argument for saying this is the right thing to be maximized.
It just seems like from the individual perspective, this should be weighted by how related you are to the offspring or something.
Well, if we were trying to develop a genetic story here, we would certainly have to be doing that, yeah.
Okay.
And that's not, and that would be a good way to go. That's a good point. Okay, so then we do some substitution. We get rid of M in the optimization problem by solving it out. And what we're left with is trying to maximize this births per capita in the population, a kind of crude birth rate, by varying the size of the total population, the proportion of reproducers, and the amount of time devoted per reproducer to reproduction. Okay, and we get these three first-order conditions. This one is just the one about production, and it says production, the number of producers should be the one that makes the average product equal the marginal product and maximizes out per capita, out per producer output, as in that diagram I drew earlier. So this one, this condition is going to be satisfied with an interior optimum. This one, this is showing a trade-off. Oh, if you have one more one more reproducer, a bigger P means more reproducers, you'll get more fertility F, but it's going to cost you because that'll take someone out of foraging, G prime, and it'll also cost an additional energy input, M, and so you're going to be looking for the right trade-off between the positives and negatives here. And similarly here, if you increase the time available for reproduction, then you're losing some time for production and so on. Okay, yeah.
I have a question about that last point. I'm not sure I understand properly at the last part about the energy for reproduction. So spending more time on reproduction per reproducer raises surviving birth because you invest more in each birth.
Yeah.
You reduce foraging time because you're removing someone from the population.
Yeah.
But if you have more birth for the same number of individuals, it seems to me you need less energy per reproduction unit, right?
Say that again. If you have more reproducers, no.
No, you have the same amount of reproducer, but you have more surviving birth. Then the unit of energy you need for each surviving birth is going down. So that would be on the positive side. Wouldn't that be? I'm not looking
Still
at
not
the equation.
getting, let's see, you're saying spending more time in reproduction raises surviving births, yes, but reduces foraging time and energy for reproduction. Here's the reduced foraging time and its effect, and then this is the effect of the reduced amount of food available for reproduction. So this is going to lead to fewer births. This would lead to more births.
So here, when you say energy for reproduction, you mean for each reproducer, or you
Or
mean
did
for
I
each
say? Let's see, what did I
You
say?
say just reproduction.
Okay, energy is coming through M. Yeah. So.
For reproducer, okay. But you
we're
have
okay?
more surviving birth, so you increase.
Yeah. So that's the trade-off. That's the trade-off. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so on the middle expression, is the X does not play any role in determining optimal N? Am I reading that right?
Yes. You're
Is there
reading
any
it right.
intuition there why you wouldn't?
Well,
Is the total number of children or something like that? Not
these
the-
are. There isn't a scaling variable in either of these, but this one does have scale in it. That's the first increasing and then diminishing returns. I'm going to now, this is the main result, which is completely opaque, which I'm now going to interpret. But what it's saying is you can't be at an optimum for both X, the time reproducers spend reproducing, and P, the proportion that is reproducing. And you get different cases here. And let me also mention that when you have a negative derivative here, because you're not at an optimum, so it's not zero. So if this is saying, oh, if you increase the proportion of reproducers, then the effect on fertility is going to be negative. Okay, that means if you could reduce the proportion of reproducers, then fertility would go up. Well, that's going to be an important point we'll come back to. X is bounded between 0 and 1 minus t, and P is bounded between 1 over n. That's the lowest it can be, otherwise there are no reproducers at all because of the discreteness. and it has to be less than or equal to 1. So, cases, this is the chimpanzees, 100% reproducers, and they're optimized on the trade-off between time spent per infant and the energy devoted to foraging and so on. And we've already talked about this. So this isn't, it would be possible to improve this situation by reducing P and so on, but because of the genetic constraints of unrelatedness and so on, it doesn't happen. So this is probably true not only for chimps, but other great apes and baboons and primates and most animals, including non-social insects. It would be something like this story. The second case is like the wild dogs. Here we have 0, so that we have a negative effect of increasing the proportion of reproducers, and so a positive effect of reducing it. So we know they must be on a corner solution, as it were, with P equal to 1 over n. That's the case with only one female reproducer, and the others are foraging. And we have optimization on the amount of time spent reproducing, which lines up with the wild dogs because the female is only reproducing like half of the year, and the other half she's producing. And so at that margin, there's optimization. Okay, so that's the case of African wild dog and wolves and probably many other animals. This is the case of humans and the toothed whales. You can vary, by varying the age at menopause, you can vary P however you like between 0 and 1, even though every female is reproductive at some point. So there's optimization here. You're not at a corner, you're optimizing on the proportion reproductive, but if you only had more time, if you only had another 5 years to reproduce in, you could have higher fertility. Okay, so that's, I don't know what happened, well, anyway. Okay, I know we're almost out of time, so let me just, the third case we just did, blah, blah, blah. Now, in fact, young reproductive women do some foraging in hunter-gatherer societies, but their efficiency is substantially reduced. For example, lactating Aceh women with weaned dependents that they also have to worry about, plus carrying around the baby they're breastfeeding and so on, they only acquire about 1/3 of the calories per day that non-lactating women without weaned dependents do. So it's not exactly right, either for, certainly not for whales and nor for humans, it's just an approximation. The last case, and then I'll be done, is the eusocial insect case. Here again we have a negative derivative, and that's telling us, again, we're at a corner at the lowest possible proportion of reproductive females, which is 1 over n, which might be 1 in a colony of 100,000 or 1,000,000 or something like that. If it could be even lower, the birth rate would be even higher, but it can't be because they're at a corner. And then d pi dx is greater than 0 if that queen had more time to spend reproducing, then she could produce even more births. But she doesn't. She's at a corner. All she's doing is reproducing. Time spent foraging is 0. She's fully specialized in reproduction and does 0 foraging. And that makes it eusocial, as with the naked mole rat.
Do you want to?
Done.
Do you want to do this last slide?
Huh?
Do you want to do this last slide? Is this your last slide?
Yeah, and we've already, I don't need to summarize or anything. Longer than intended, but there.
No problem. So let's start out with a couple of questions, and then I want to get some questions from our students, and then we'll come back to the general audience. We'll start with the general audience.
Yes, so I saw you have time as a limited resource. But I was wondering why, as an economist, you didn't emphasize the foraging possibility of being limited and different groups being in competition for the external resources.
Okay, say that again.
So the groups are getting their food from
Yeah.
the environment, and they're limited in time, but I don't see that your environment is limited. That one group might deplete the environment before the other group.
Well, that's what I was saying early on. If these groups are, if the density is low, if land is abundant and population is scarce and so on, they will be growing. And as they grow, maybe they exceed that point where average product equals marginal product. They're going to fission. If they're bees, they're going to swarm. They're going to hive off and add more groups. And density is going to go up. And eventually, they'll be forced to the point where they're just in equilibrium, at least in the deterministic world. And at that point, all these groups will be an average product equals marginal product, and there isn't any kind of external availability beyond that.
What about different species competing for the same?
That would be a more complicated story, which I'd love to be able to tell, but I don't. Yeah.
So you mentioned this enormously interesting and bold statement of non-reproducing females, and it seems like you didn't round out your statements with summarizing that information, or what are the consequences of that, or what fraction of the population then could get away with being reproductive, exploring that space, and non-reproductive.
Well, I mean, we go all the way from 100% of females being reproductive all the time for chimps, down to essentially 0% or 1/1,000,000th.
I mean, I'm thinking of the human case in particular.
Oh, the human case.
Yeah.
The human case here looks like it's about 50-50. That is, the mean age of beginning reproduction is around 19, first birth for females. And the mean age at last birth is around 43. So if something like, say, 23 years of reproducing, and the life expectancy at age 45, I said it was 20, so at 43, I guess it would be like 22. So they're roughly equal. The adult female time spent in a reproductive state and in a productive state for humans.
And what about that figure from the census that, let's say, 20% of females, I'm saying 20 or 23% in the U.S. do not reproduce?
That's a different phenomenon. I'm talking about hunter-gatherers. So
Okay.
now the world is different. We have incredible consumption opportunities, travel opportunities, different social norms. Yeah, well.
I'm just curious to come back to this argument about chimps being inefficient. When you were starting off by talking about this in a world of convergent evolution, so how are they surviving as inefficient species?
Well, I think they're inefficient in two ways. One is that the males contribute virtually nothing to reproduction beyond sperm, and I think it's because of the non-genetic relatedness.
But it has evolutionary history just not been long enough to fix that.
To exclude that so that,
It just seemed to be on their way.
I mean, you observe, I think it's clear that there is room, let's say in an optimal world, for an entire range of reproductive arrangements, productive arrangements, you have solitary bees and you have honeybees and so on and so forth. I think these big social groups tend to occur in more fertile environments and the mountainsides and so on. You get more of the solitary. I think I've read that, but yeah, I can't tell you why. Why is it? That's a good question.
I'm just curious.
Maybe that's a little bit of
natural selection
contingent
just hasn't
evolution.
been had enough time to work
Yeah.
its method.
So I'm curious how the students are going to divide their questioning. Concentrated into one
Next
person?
1 minute.
Concentrated on one person, or are you going to share it out between you? Any questions from the students?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it seemed like sociality was so central to this paper, but most of it, like I got echoes of sociality through production, reproduction, and then a little bit through like intergenerational exchanges in the case of, older generations helping. But I wonder about how could we incorporate sociality as more of a continuous variable, and I don't think there's an answer to this, but you could think about like maybe pheromonal exchanges in the case of the insects, or like number of contacts, probably there's no data, but it would be interesting to think about it more continuously, considering you're thinking about the life force, right?
In truth, I'm not sure what the biological definition of sociality is.
Yeah.
And I might not like it if I did know. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point.
Frequency of contact, and then you could quantify that for humans, and you could quantify that for
Yeah.
insects and animals.
I think that's an interesting question, and I'll think about it.
Given how important the function G was in this equation, how that, I'm gathering, would change if environment changes,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be smart evolution to produce flexibility? And so all of the examples you have seem to be very inflexible. They have these systems, and there's going to be one alpha this or not. I guess menopause could change, but they seem to
Well, it
be...
could change
Right.
at over a million or
At least it could
100,000
change
years or something.
Yeah, fair enough. But but all of these systems seem so rigid for when the animals that survive well should be able to adjust to changing environments and so on. So it seems like maybe that's an oversight of Darwin's.
Well, group size varies. I guess flexibility comes with costs. It's always cheaper to,
Especially.
Yeah. and I'm not really qualified to say how flexible these beings are. Anyway.
If we want to bring males into the story, can we just define the P? Was that your fraction reproducing? And can we explain sex? Why they're males and females? Why the fraction would be 50-50 or 10-90 or? It's the same model. Can we just apply this model to the question of why is there sex?
Well, I don't think we get anywhere applying it to the question of why there is sex, but I have seen a discussion a little bit along these lines of the sex ratio at birth. And
There was a dissertation, I think, that you were a committee member for, a dissertation like 30 years ago about looking at sex ratio at birth and how it varied.
But there was this McNutt and somebody paper on the African wild dogs on the sex ratio at birth and how it responded to the marginal contributions of males versus females. And I would expect that the eusocial insects control the ratio of females to drones. And it's one of the striking things, and of course we know there are species of fish where they I think they're initially all females, and then one of them becomes male and is the leader of the group, and then if that one dies, then another female becomes male, and so the sex ratio itself can be flexible in the way that Carl Mason would want to see it be.
So,
Anyway, I'm talking, who knows?
so why wouldn't this framework, why, how is a male different from a non-reproducing female?
Well, the non-reproducing females are all working hard and helping to raise the offspring. But in most species, the males are doing Zippo. They might as well not exist after their initial contribution of sperm. So, but in the wild dogs and humans, and they are. In the eusocial insects, they're not. Well, in most eusocial insects, they're not. I think in termites, the males work as well. But I think the typical situation is where the males are off somewhere else and the females are doing the work.
Well, with the dogs, the males are hunting along with the
Yeah.
females, and so there's really no difference between a non-reproducing female and a male, except
Yeah.
for the genetic part of it.
Yeah,
The genetic part.
I believe
So
that's
in
correct.
eusocial insects, isn't it the case that if you have non-reproductive females, they can potentially stage a coup?
Well, at some point, if the queen's reproduction begins to flag, if she's used up her sperm or something like that, then they will depose her, and then the non-reproductives do have rudimentary ovaries and so on, and they will try to sneak in some births, and their sisters will try to kill any such. But is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
I guess I just mean that to me is a good reason to have male drones rather than non-reproductive females in a colony, to control the sex ratio in that way.
But I'm not understanding. Then where does the sex ratio come in?
Because if it's the same thing to have male drones and non-reproductive females, and you have equal numbers, there's a lot more opportunities for sedition.
No, I think the non-reproductive females, if they sneak in reproduction, I think it's without male contribution. Some of these species, correct me, those of you if you know more about it, but in some of these cases, if you have a fertilized female, she will give birth to a female. If it's a non-fertilized egg, it'll grow up to be male, something like this. Ken might know, or someone else.
Are you saying though that the men would defend the queen? So that, like, if you had a non-reproductive female who wanted to become a reproductive female, the men would uphold the order, and if they weren't there, that would be more.
No, the men don't defend. They're
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Ron.